I'm Julia Coakley, and on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to our market briefing this afternoon, which is being delivered by Browne Jacobson. First of all, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping points before we start. Do please keep your microphone and your camera off, and if you would like to ask a question, please enter that in the chat box that's at the bottom of your screen. These questions will be answered during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and if we run out of time, we will answer your questions post-event. MGAA market briefings and insights are accredited by the CII and allow you to record CPD hours if this is relevant to your ongoing professional development. The recording of this presentation will be available on our website and the MGAA YouTube channel, and the PowerPoint presentation will be sent in due course. Please take time to respond to our feedback survey post-presentation, as your views are incredibly important to the MGAA team. We take your comments and your observations very, very seriously, and it does help to shape our market briefings and insights programmes going forward. So today's webinar, Transforming Equity, Diversity and Inclusion in UK Insurance, EDI, Lessons for MGAs, is being delivered by Jeremy Irvin, Partner and Head of Financial Services Regulation, Browne Jacobson, Raymond Silverstein, Partner and Head of Employment and Business Immigration Law, Louise Mullaney, Professor in Sociolinguistics and Founder and Director of Linguistics Profiling for Professionals, and Dr. Victoria Howard, Lead on the Knowledge Transfer Partnership, University of Nottingham. Jeremy's work with MGAs and other insurance firms include advice on environmental, social and governance (ESG) issues, such as senior manager training, board effectiveness, the consumer duty, operational resilience and vulnerable customers, all of which involve questions of equality, diversity and inclusion. Jeremy has wide expertise in regulatory supervision, notifications, whistleblowing, investigations and enforcement on conduct, governance and prudential matters in multiple financial services sectors. Dr. Howard specialises in investigating language, equality, diversity and inclusion in professional settings. She's been working in the Linguistic Profiling for Professionals business unit at University of Nottingham since 2017 and previously worked as a pensions and employees benefits solicitor and consultant for international firms in London and Zurich. Professor Mullaney specialises in the delivery of knowledge, exchange and research impact with industry partners. She has 25 years experience working collaboratively with external organisations in the fields of business, health and political communications, and she specialises in investigating issues of diversity and inclusion with particular expertise in gender marginalised identities and workplace equality. Raymond is also Joint Head of Employment Practices Group in Pangaea-Net, an international network of law firms. Also at Browne Jacobson. Recognised by the Legal 500, he advises clients, including insurance firms, on every aspect of employment law, including complex disciplinaries, grievances and claims, reorganisations, relocations, senior executive exits and modern slavery issues. So Jeremy, if I might hand over to you.
Thank you, Julia. Good afternoon, everybody. So here we are. This is a follow-up event to a survey and report conducted by University of Nottingham, supported by Browne Jacobson, and which the MGAA as an organisation was instrumental in supporting and helping to find individuals to be interviewed and surveyed to provide data, and Louise, Professor Mullaney, will explain more about the methodology as we go forward. There's a lot to get through, I think it's worth saying, so I'm really going to rattle through my few slides, and obviously would be delighted to take any questions at the end. It will probably be best given the amounts that we have to talk about, but there will also be contact details at the end, so do please feel free to reach out to us if you'd like any further discussion of any of the points raised. Next slide, please, Victoria. So the learning objectives here, you can see them on the screen. I'm not going to read them out. The key to this is that the survey and the report were about benchmark data, and today's event gives everybody who's watching the chance to think where they stand in relation to that benchmark data and how they can use that benchmark data to establish or enhance their own practices in relation to EDI. Next slide, please, Victoria. Again, very quickly, many may ask, why do this? Why do this at all? Why focus on these issues? The answer to it is twofold. There are many who would regard the pursuit of equality or equity, diversity, inclusion as a worthwhile end in itself and of considerable social and economic value, including economic value where there is a growing set of academic and consulting analysis which suggests that improved EDI is better for performance, economic performance of firms all round, including in insurance, including and that would include MGAs. But even if that's not, if people are not convinced by the academic and other papers in this regard, it is nevertheless, this is a pressure area, this is a hot button issue for the UK financial services regulators, both the PRA, Prudential Regulation Authority, and the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA. And the FCA in particular is leading the charge across EDI in a number of areas, in a number of financial sectors, but has specifically identified insurance as having work to do in relation to EDI. So one can either look at this in terms of development or an evolution, or in terms of simply sort of defence and risk management in respect of compliance risk. But either way, it's important and it's valid. And the key to the whole project, as I said at the start, was really about benchmark data. It was about establishing good quality, credible information, comprehensive information, so that firms and individuals and the management of firms can understand where they stand and where changes might be made. So with that sort of lightning fast introduction, I'm now delighted to hand over to Professor Mullaney.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. So we'll start off by giving you an overview of the research and a bit of background, and then go into the executive summary of the findings, and then Victoria will take over and drill down the findings in more detail. So it's worth saying at this point that our project was funded by the UKRI, the Universities Research and Innovation Fund, Innovate UK, KTP project, and it was also co-funded by the University of Nottingham's Infinity Research Hub, which is a new hub that's been launched in the last 18 months to look at issues of diversity and inclusion in financial services. So it's very much a new initiative, and an initiative where the University of Nottingham is really keen to grow both research, teaching, and also looking at collaborative links into business engagement as well. Okay, so next slide, please, Victoria. So the approach that we took then was we were aware of the fact that we were the first independent organisation to be conducting a survey and set of interviews of this nature. There are lots of different surveys that are out there that look at EDI data from lots of different angles. And what we really wanted to do was to bring an approach where we looked at people's opinions and looked at their everyday experiences in detail. So we had 125 participants that took place. In terms of the participation criteria, anybody could participate providing they had worked in the insurance industry in the UK in the last 12 months. We aim to get people working at all kinds of different levels, including obviously MGAs. And we ran the survey from January to July this year. So it's current data. It's from the earlier part of this year. We really wanted this study to look at the voices of the employee. And we found that too often there are lots of surveys that are done. People can feel compelled to fill them out, but you don't really get that emphasis on what the employee is experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So that was the approach that we took with the data, was to look at those everyday lived experiences and to see what's going on and to really look at the key issues that sit behind this to come up with some benchmarking data. Next slide, please. So to give you an overall executive summary of what we found then, many of our research participants pointed out that there have been improvements in the EDI industry, particularly over the last 5 years. Firms are clearly taking steps, setting up working groups, implementing training. So existing approaches and initiatives are there. However, in terms of how they are evaluated and judged, they were only rated as effective by 40% of our participants. They were widely described as being very superficial, and the assessment and evaluation of them was not supported by any rigorous data. So the initiatives were there. Some of them were described as just being kind of tokenistic smokescreens to EDI that didn't have any real depth or value to the business or to the firm in question. So there was a sense that approaches need more rigor. They need to be data informed. Decision-making and employee consultation needs to take place as well. So we're looking at what employees actually want and what the issues are on the ground from the employees themselves. We also found that there's a need to consider equity, diversity and inclusion as a workplace cultural issue, not just something that's measured in terms of metrics. So there's an awful lot of talk in the mass media and within industry, across different industries, that you need to look at the statistics alone and look at how many people you've got from different backgrounds coming into the firm, and that's your EDI. And what the approach that we've taken is that that's just one small part, one small step of EDI. What you actually need to do is look at the workplace culture as a whole and look at that everyday lived experience of how people interact in the workplace, how they experience work, what kind of forms of discrimination or prejudice or bias may be at play that you can't see if you just look superficially at the numbers. So we're not questioning the fact that metrics are very important. Of course they are, but of course they are just one part of a very complicated and nuanced picture that also needs to be considered as well. And then the final finding that we had is EDI is everybody's responsibility. It's something that everybody can benefit from. When we talk about EDI, what we're talking about is fairness for all, not just people with protected characteristics. Organisations that we've worked with over the past 15 years have found that when you pay attention to EDI and respond to initiatives, whether it's from regulators or other bodies, the value to the organisation as a whole is social, it's cultural, but it's also financial as well. And we can talk about that a little bit more in the questions, but basically the point that we're making here is that everybody has a role to play regardless of who you are, and it's everybody's responsibility to build an inclusive culture. And it's also everybody's responsibility to call out inappropriate behaviour if you see that happening. And I'll explain all of these points in more detail next. I'm going to hand over to Victoria, who's going to do that with you. Thanks, Victoria.
Yeah. So to delve into some of those findings now in a little more detail, we asked research participants about their experiences of EDI in their own organisations. And 69% said that they do have a written approach to EDI in their organisation. So that might be that they had a charter, they had a statement, some sort of written document that signalled very clearly what the expectations around EDI are in that organisation. And as Louise has just mentioned, there were a number of positive initiatives. For example, that there were working groups established, that there was improved diversity in recruitment in recent times. However, there was that underlying concern from a number of participants that many initiatives were superficial. They were lip service, they were tick box exercises, and they weren't really driving meaningful change. And we found from participants that this has a meaningful impact on attrition, on retention and attraction of good candidates. There's a quote there at the very bottom of the slide. I used to work as a London market broker, but decided to move to insurance consulting because I could foresee the challenges in my career due to my gender and race and did not want to be limited by the market culture and traditions. And we heard from a number of people with similar comments that they had left organisations where they felt that they couldn't progress because of their gender, their sexuality, their race, for example. And on the other side of the coin, people were actively seeking out organisations that had better EDI values, that had values that aligned with their own values and approach to work. I'm moving on to talk about flexible working next. People agreed, 75% of those we spoke to agreed that flexible working benefits EDI. They felt that flexible working, for example, part-time working, working from home sometimes, was particularly beneficial to people who were parents and carers, and that this was a very good way of ensuring that some people who would have otherwise had to leave the workforce because they couldn't continue to work in the office 5 days a week were able to stay in the workforce. So, for example, they could work from home sometimes rather than cutting their hours back to part-time. And some people from marginalised groups reported that they actually felt safer working from home. They didn't experience the microaggressions and the othering that sometimes took place in the office. However, that said, there were some concerns that flexible working raised some issues, not least that there were some negative attitudes that persisted amongst people in organisations at all levels. For example, that people who were working from home were considered to be shirking sometimes, and that people who asked to work part-time were considered to have given up on their career, that they weren't really ambitious, that they didn't want promotion. And there were these assumptions made that that's what part-time working or working from home would mean. And also in the bottom right-hand corner, a comment that came through in a number of different responses that there's a risk perhaps that in time there becomes a further prejudice between those who come into the office frequently and those who do not, and this will need to be monitored. So the lack of visibility, the sort of out of sight, out of mind approach means that those in the office might be missing out on some of the career advancement opportunities that would be available if they were present in the office. I want to talk a bit about alcohol in workplaces now. We had a number of responses that mentioned how their workplace culture involved a number of alcohol-related social activities. So whether that was team building, whether it was client relationships, social activities within teams. But this was felt to be quite exclusive of some groups of people on several grounds. For example, people who don't participate in alcohol-related events for personal reasons, for cultural or religious reasons, parents and carers who perhaps can't hang around after work because they've got nursery or school pickups, and also those who just feel vulnerable around people who are consuming a lot of alcohol. Particularly women reported that when their colleagues were obviously intoxicated, they felt quite vulnerable that something bad might happen. And we found that excessive alcohol consumption contributed to a number of incidents of discrimination, particularly around sexism and racism. There was a sense of dread from some. Again, in the bottom right-hand corner, you spend 1 hour with them at drinks and someone's going to make an inappropriate comment or somebody's going to make a reference that borders the line of racism. And those kind of incidents occurred in a number of different settings and ranged in seriousness. Switching to look now at career progression in a little more detail. 68% of women from ethnic groups other than white reported that their race and gender was adversely affecting their career progression. And indeed, it was over half of everybody who was a woman and everybody who came from an ethnic group that wasn't white who reported a sense that their career progression had been adversely affected. And this ranged in a number of different ways. On the grounds of gender, a number of women felt that they were asked to perform more menial tasks, so they might be asked to organise the leaving present, to look after somebody who was feeling upset. They might be asked to do the administrative tasks like taking the minutes in a meeting. And there's an example there that the top quote is actually from a head of department who had once organised lunch for a meeting she was attending. And as we go to close the call, the non-executive director comments saying, "Oh, you're going to order some sandwiches for tomorrow?" I exploded. right, let me tell you about sexism and bias in the workplace. You can do it yourself because nobody's preventing you from ordering the sandwiches. I'm not a Starbucks, right? And I'm certainly not the cook of the business. And we heard from a number of people who'd experienced similar situations. A number of women and people from UK ethnic minorities reported they had to work harder, they had to do more, they had to be seen to be achieving a significantly greater level in order to progress at work than their male, particularly white counterparts. And people drew attention to an affinity bias where people who were more likely to have a rapport with somebody who followed the same football team, who went to the same school or university. And there was a sense that those who had those contacts and had those relationships already and were able to identify with others who were like them were more likely to give opportunities to those people than to spread them more widely across the workforce. And in terms of actual discrimination, so 37% of people reported they had been exposed to discriminatory language or behaviour, and those characteristics to which they relate are ranked in this sequence. So sex and race were the most commonly occurring grounds for discrimination. And this ranged from sexualised behaviour, from anti-LGBTQA sentiments and slights and microaggressions, to really overt incidents of racism. So only yesterday, someone said chocolates person in the office, and other incidents of racism that sort of import this very Western-centric, very heteronormative attitude to appearance. For example, somebody who wore braids in their hair reported that everybody wanted to touch their hair when they walked in the office, and that made them feel very, very old and as if they didn't belong in the situation in quite the same way as their colleagues. So in terms of reporting, so while 72% of people said, in theory, yes, I would feel comfortable reporting an EDI issue, actually, of those who had reported, only 14% said that they'd received a satisfactory response, and nobody was very satisfied with how their report had been handled. This was particularly on three grounds. One, that they reported having made a complaint, that they were frozen out, that there were negative consequences, that they were viewed as a troublemaker. Secondly, that there were concerns that the people who had caused the problems were friends with HR or were very senior, so a complaint wasn't handled objectively. And then thirdly, they pointed out how much they valued it when somebody who hadn't actually experienced the discrimination stepped forward as an ally and challenged it in the moment or reported it as a witness later. And this played a huge role in taking some of the burden off people who were already feeling marginalised in the workplace. They don't have to stick their head above the parapet to make the complaint themselves, that somebody is behind them, is supporting them and is able to do that with them or for them. And then finally, we asked participants, what can we do? What will help to make your workplace fairer for everybody? And the main suggestion that came up was training. Unconscious bias, awareness and bystander training to equip people with the skills to identify bias and to address it in a meaningful way. But this is part of a network of measures. Training alone will not fix the problem. And there was a sense in some situations that training could be also quite a tick box exercise. It could be not sufficiently thought through, not particularly high quality. There's a real need to ensure that any training that is implemented is regularly reviewed, it's refreshed, it's updated, and it's relevant to the workplace. So that's a whistle-stop tour through our findings. I'll just head back to Louise now, who's going to talk about some considerations for employers and those working in organisations. Thanks, Louise.
Thanks, Victoria. So key considerations then. So we've given you the evidence. What would be advised thinking about? So if you flick onto the next one for me. So the first 3 points then. First of all, focus on building an inclusive culture. And by this, we mean work on changing the narrative around equity, diversity and inclusion. Organisations need a strategy which needs to be developed with senior buy-in and with employee consultation. So again, picking up on what we said earlier, don't just look at the numbers, but look at culture, look at those kind of broader considerations as well, and listen to the experiences of employees and others in the industry. One of the findings that that was quite prominent in our research was that even in smaller companies where people felt like there was a family feel, there were still negative experiences around EDI. The second point then, we've mentioned flexibility, and the positives of this. Making flexibility work, of course, is a different thing. So employers must meet their statutory obligations, and there'll be more on this from Ray soon. I'll hold that over for him to come in and talk about the employment law angle on this. The third point then, eliminate potential bias in processes. So for example, there might be ways in which recruitment job advertisements are worded that might be putting people off applying. So having a critical and reflexive look at how jobs are advertised. Also, promotions procedures and rewards criteria for annual reviews or appraisals need to be looked at. And a key part of this is looking beyond stereotypes that might be there for particular job roles. There's some links on the slides. You'll all get a copy of the slides after the presentation that take you through to some resources that we've developed at the University of Nottingham that are freely available, which give you alternative ways to recruit and alternative ways to think about job advertisements. Right, next slide, please. In terms of building work relationships without alcohol, it's a case of thinking about lots of other activities that could take part, such as crazy golf or different ways of doing away days. We've seen quite categorically that alcohol will fuel racism, sexism and discrimination. And several respondents told us about a sense of looming dread that they have when they know that such occasions are going to take place. And then, of course, drinking cultures will exclude many, many groups. So people that have got caring responsibilities that can't stay after work, or people that don't drink for any religious reasons or reason of belief. And those who find that being around intoxicated people make them feel vulnerable. So thinking about alternative ways of doing work and doing work in a kind of social sense as well. Point 6 then, promoting collective responsibility for EDI. This includes thinking about what I've mentioned earlier, really, and thinking about that in more detail, making sure that everybody feels like they are responsible and you have that collective culture. So it's not just the responsibility of people who have been discriminated against or people that are discriminating bias, that everyone in an organisation feels able to call out behaviour. And that has to be championed from senior leaders and from senior management. Next point then, the importance of developing robust and fair reporting channels. These need to be fair, they need to be open. They also need to be prominently advertised so people know where they can go when things happen. And picking up on the earlier point, the allies or people that are around that are in supporting roles need to help by supporting as well and reporting what they see and hear. We've also had one of the suggestions that we've come up with is whether or not this needs to be separated from formal HR functions, as our research suggests that there's an element of mistrust in some organisations that HR might be friends with the culprits or might need to have a more objective space where these particular issues can be discussed. And then finally, implement and evaluate EDI training, with the key emphasis there being on evaluation. Don't just come up with a kind of 20-minute unconscious bias online course and use it as a tick box exercise, but look at the kind of courses that are offered, make sure they're rigorous, make sure they're robust, and make sure they're being positively evaluated by the people that are taking them as well. Because of course, these are windows into how seriously an organisation is perceived to take these EDI issues. Okay. And then the final slide from us before we hand over to Ray is just a clickable slide really that takes you through to the full report, which was published in September 2023. So if you'd like to go and read the full thing in its entirety, that link will take you through. Okay, I'll now hand over to Ray.
Thank you very much, Louise, and good afternoon, MGAs. So as Louise said, I'm going to look at the employment law do's and don'ts that really flow from this report. Also what is coming down the track to help prepare you for some changes that are coming next year and the year after that. And hopefully you'll pick up on some common themes as we go through. But all of this is clearly to help you to transform your approach to EDI in your organizations. And just to confirm that this report is genuinely a landmark report. As far as I'm aware, having a third party come in and sort of mark your homework has not been done before, and certainly not in this sort of very academically rigorous fashion. So I would encourage you all to take a look at the report. And here is what I'm planning to cover. It is quite a lot, and it's going to be a bit of a gallop, but the slides, as you know, will be available to you afterwards to have a look at, and our contact details will be on them. Next slide, please. So general positive action. So positive discrimination, as you probably know, is illegal. You can't do it, but positive action, general positive action, is completely legal so long as you follow the rules. It's very misunderstood, and it's often, pretty much always, overlooked by many employers who think it's more complicated than it actually is. But it can actually be used to help transform EDI in your organizations. And the purpose of general positive action is to level the playing field. As the slide shows, an employer can take proportionate action that aims to reduce the 3 bullet points referred to. Next slide, please. And it's not a particularly high test for the employer to meet in order to take general positive action. It's a reasonable belief in the 4 items referred to. So in-depth, detailed statistical information is not required, and actually you as an organization will almost certainly have the data already at your fingertips that you can use in order to take general positive action to level the playing field. Reasonable belief is all that you need. An example of taking general positive action, depending on the evidence that you find, is what I call fishing in different ponds. So in terms of your recruitment, you may, if you feel that a particular group that has a particular protected characteristic is underrepresented, then you can legitimately go looking to recruit from that group in a different place. And that's just something which you can take lawfully to improve your EDI. Next slide, please. We were going to do a poll at this point, but I think time is somewhat against us. But the question is, how many of your organizations are in the process of reviewing your approach to flexible working? And the reason, next slide please. And the reason that I'm asking this is partly, as you've already heard, that 75% of participants to the study think that flexible working benefits EDI. So that on itself may be a sufficient trigger to reset your organization's approach to flexible working. But from a strictly legal point of view, change is on the way. So there's a new Act of Parliament that will make important changes to flexible working from the middle of next year that will give new rights to employees. Next slide, please. And here are the changes that are coming. And I'm not going to read them out because you can hopefully see them on the slide. And they are significant. I mean, just to pick out 2 requests in any 12-month period, which is double the current number. Employees won't actually have to explain the effect that they think the request could have on the employer or how it can be dealt with, which I think is a shame, but that's a change. And something that does actually catch out an awful lot of employers is how long an employer has to respond to such a request. So currently the period is 3 months, which includes dealing with any appeal, and it's the appeal part that catches employers out all the time. But that's been reduced by 1/3 to 1 month to include any appeal. So if a flexible work request comes in, you really have to get your skates on in order to comply with a very tight time limit. The Act does make provision for employees to have the right to request flexible working from day 1 of the employment, So currently there's a qualifying period. It is not clear yet whether that part of the Act will be brought into force, but certainly some employers are getting ahead of the game by giving staff that right from day one, although I think it's fair to say that most are waiting to see if that change actually becomes law. So if you are not refreshing and reviewing your approach to flexible working, then now would be a very good time to do it ahead of the changes. Next slide, please. You would have seen these statistics earlier in this talk, and they are clearly troubling from a risk and organisational point of view, if not for any other. And as Jeremy has said, we're not getting into the ethics of any of this particularly, but just from a risk and organisational point of view, these are troubling statistics, although I think it's also fair to say that the situation has been improving gradually over time. But this is not where you want to be, but it provides you with a useful benchmark. So what should your organisation be doing to improve the situation? And I think it's useful to look at the EHRC code and to pressure test what their guidance is and what you could be doing as an organisation to improve the situation. So it's just trying to get away from a business as usual approach to recruitment and career progression by looking at job adverts, role descriptions, promotions and reward criteria. And it links in very neatly with general positive action in terms of the sort of steps that you can be taking to improve the situation in your organisation, and making sure that everyone's given an equal opportunity here, that how you approach recruitment and career progression for everybody from all backgrounds is key. And there is a lot of statistical evidence to show that whilst some organisations are very good at recruiting a diverse workforce, when you look back and see how those people's careers progress within those organisations, there's an awful lot of attrition. So getting people in is great, but keeping them and moving them through an organisation is the real challenge here. And perceptions of nepotism damage morale and again lead to staff attrition and loss of talent and is harmful to EDI. So a failure to inform staff of opportunities for promotion may actually be discriminatory. It's what used to be called the old boys network. Probably can't say old anymore, but you know what I'm saying, in terms of word of mouth and people outside of the bubble not being given an opportunity to apply for a promotion and others just mysteriously being appointed. Next slide, please. Again, this is a statistic you would have seen, but it is a troubling finding from the report. 37% of participants have seen or heard discriminatory language at work. That's pretty shocking, I think it's fair to say. And the point that I really want to kind of bring out from the slide, or the points, are the intention. That intention is irrelevant. It doesn't matter what the intent behind a comment or an action was. It's the effect that it has that matters. Setting targets to monitor and improve is key. But I think a fundamental point is the role of HR, and that's been alluded to already. I think HR need to be given the power and the authority to take proportionate action when necessary. HR can often be seen as the tool of management, and in some ways they are, but at the same time they do have this separate role of protecting staff when necessary, and it's difficult, but I think that's something which HR really need to be empowered to do to try and improve the situation and get that percentage down. Next slide, please. So second poll, and we're going to do the same thing as before. This is a festive, somewhat festive poll, as it's office Christmas season. So I'm going to ask how many of your organisations are reviewing their approach to combating sexual harassment of their staff. And the reason that I'm saying that is because there's a new law, as you may know, coming into effect next October, and that is going to impose a positive duty on all employers, regardless of size, to take reasonable steps to prevent the sexual harassment of their staff by other staff. And if the employer fails to comply with that duty, then the amount of compensation that can be awarded to an employee can be increased by up to 25%. And there is no cap on compensation. So that could add significantly to an award for sexual harassment. Sexual harassment would have to be linked to a protected characteristic, normally sex, but it's a shift of burden on the employer to create a positive duty. Next slide, please. And it chimes very well, as does the season, with what's been said about drinking culture. And you can read what's on the slide about that as well. I don't think it's any secret that drinking culture and after hours culture can other the sorts of the groups of people we've talked about, those with childcare responsibilities, or for whom, for cultural or religious reasons, drinking excessive amounts of alcohol and after work gatherings just doesn't work. And it also increases the risk of things like sexual harassment and racism. So from a risk point of view, it's a bit of a loaded gun. So it's something to think about, and to think about alternatives, more inclusive ways to promote inclusivity if you can, and that's been mentioned. Next slide, please. So these are just some ideas to consider how to deal with the drinking culture. I think, you know, we don't want to be too puritanical, if you like, about all of this. I like a drink as much as the next person, but I think that for all the reasons we're talking about, these are the kind of issues, the kind of points to consider, and it's food and it's drink. And just to pick out a couple of points from the slide, really, reputational risk. That's clearly a problem within the organisation and in front of clients. Regulatory repercussions. So if drink leads to conduct, then clearly for those individuals, that could have very serious, potentially career-ending regulatory repercussions. And I think it's normally a very good idea to send a message around to all staff before work-related events, just to remind them of how they are expected to behave and not to behave at any work-related events. So, and work-related events has a fairly extended meaning, and it protects the organisation to do that. You know, there is no reason not to. People can still have a good time. And again, it links back to the point about empowering HR to take appropriate action when necessary if people fall foul of, you know, fall below the standard that's required of them. This statistic, I think, is probably one of the most concerning findings of all from the report, and I think that is something which really does need to change in order for the culture within an organisation to improve. Including in relation to EDI. And at the risk of repeating myself, the role of HR, I think, is actually paramount. People need to know how to raise a complaint. And I think if an organisation should monitor satisfaction levels, and hopefully if satisfaction levels improve, then it could consider even publishing the percentage improvement year on year to encourage more people to raise the alarm. And things like bystander training would probably help as well. Next slide, please. And just a couple of points on EDI training. There is an awful lot of cynicism around EDI training and tick box exercises as well. So I think now would be an extremely appropriate time to reinvigorate your EDI training program. Quality is key to avoid the tick box exercise thing and the cynicism that I've referred to. Listen and act on feedback that you receive when themes emerge. Act authentically, because staff can smell non-authentic behaviour a mile off. And fundamentally, leadership. This has got to come from the very top of the organisation if the organisation is going to improve. Next slide, please. And as Jeremy mentioned at the very beginning of all of this, EDI is the very clear direction of travel from the regulators. And you'll all be aware that there's draft rules to implement DNI recently published, which the regulators are planning to introduce next year, although they won't take effect straight away. Like it or hate it, this is the direction of travel. And if for no other reason than to protect your organisation, you cannot ignore it. And I would suggest that you take a look at those draft rules, but I've set out a summary of the proposals. I think at this point, sorry, the last point I was going to make is in terms of the fit and proper test and non-financial misconduct is clearly a theme that we are all getting a lot more familiar with and should take account of. And I'm just going to pass back to Jeremy for his final points.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Victoria. So, as I said at the start, this was a major project in the market. It's something which the presentation team today worked on for many months. In fact, Louise and I worked on it for many months before that. And it was widely supported, as I said, by the MGAA and other stakeholder bodies in the market, and supported as well by a number of individual client organisations. There is a lot to take in on this. There is a lot to think about. There is a lot that is very important. There is a lot which is potentially controversial. And there is a lot which runs counter to a lot of the traditions, perhaps the traditional culture of the UK insurance market, and perhaps in particular the London insurance market. But these issues don't just exist in isolation in the insurance market. They do represent broader societal challenges, and they do represent issues which are represent challenges in other financial services and other industries. So it's important that the insurance market doesn't do itself down in this regard, and it uses these findings, this data, and the pointers that Ray has given around the effective management of legal risk going forward as an opportunity. This was a point which was made, is made in the foreword of the report written by Catherine Bell of Magenta Insurance, now part of Howden, and also of the British Insurance Brokers Association. So I think it's important to take a positive approach to what's written in the report and what's been said before. and really try and find ways to identify if changes need to be made and to take a positive approach to making those changes. The learning objectives are repeated in this slide, and again, they're slightly more perhaps extensive than objectives that might have been in other presentations that the audience have been to. But it's, as I say, it is worth taking a positive approach, regardless of one's ultimate motivation for doing so. There needs to be very much a best foot forward. And certainly to pick up again on this sort of fundamental risk management point from Ray around the PRA and the FCA, they come at this in slightly different ways, but nevertheless they come to the same place, which is improved diversity and inclusion brings improved decision making, particularly around risk management, and for the FCA in particular around the treatment of customers, and in particular from that adherence to the consumer duty, and separately in terms of operational resilience. So we have 5 or so minutes left. We'll be delighted to take any questions and or to have any comments, any observations that anyone would like to make.
Thanks, Jeremy. That's great. Thank you for such a comprehensive and informative presentation. Much content there, but all incredibly valuable and very well put forward, particularly with the statistics of the research to back it up. I do have a question for you. So the question and comment is, it's been really interesting. Thank you, everyone. One question I have around collection of EDI data, particularly with the potential upcoming changes. This presents challenges for organisations in terms of GDPR. Do any of the panel have any thoughts or suggestions on this in terms of how to go about EDI data collection effectively?
Shall we start perhaps with Louise or Victoria, if you want to start, and then I think if you want to pick that up from the legal perspective, Ray.
Yeah, I think that it'd be interesting to know what Ray thinks about this in terms of the changes that are coming in. I think, given what I've said already, in a way, it might be a blessing that it will force people to not put EDI data in terms of stats at the centre of everything. And hopefully we can go for that more holistic approach. So when we're thinking about EDI, monitoring EDI, making changes to EDI practices, we're not just driven by the numbers, and we're not just driven by the stats, that we've got a kind of broader way of looking at what we want a company culture to look like, or what we want a firm culture to look like. What kind of client bases do you want to spread into next, perhaps? How can you make organizations more diverse? Not just in terms of staff makeup, but in terms of thinking, and in terms of presenting the organization, and in terms of marketing campaigns, websites. These are all areas where we do and focus linguistic analysis and do consultancy, that it kind of broadens out the web and the net of what you can do from that perspective. Particularly as the GDPR data is going to be a little bit more difficult, I think, to use comprehensively. Victoria, I don't know if you've got anything to add, or whether we want to go to Ray for the kind of legal side.
Happy to go to Ray, thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, in true lawyer style, I'm going to start off by saying I'm not a data protection specialist. We have people here that advise on that I rely on, but I do think that it is an interesting sort of approach that the regulators are taking initially, and I think this is clearly all part of a planned approach to improving the situation by, first of all, forcing firms to collect data and to have strategies and things like that. So I think that it's very much a first step towards increased regulation, but I think that we're all fairly used to having to complete questionnaires when we apply for roles and things like that asks us all sorts of questions about our ethnicity and our age and our sex and all the rest of it. So I think that is all fairly normal now, but clearly I think employers will have to use that data very carefully and make sure that data is protected and is used for positive reasons rather than anything else, and get their questions right. Because I certainly had situations where there's been inconsistencies in those sorts of questionnaires that gives people opportunities. Well, take age, for example, just as a complete sort of sideways thing, that the age bands are set far too wide to be unhelpful. So I think getting advice on the right questions to ask is absolutely key, because I think the risk is people shoot themselves in the foot, from the get-go, before they even get to mismanage the data after they've got it in the first place. So I think it all needs to be approached with a considerable amount of care and attention, because the risk is it backfires spectacularly.
Thank you, Raymond. And on that point, we are just about out of time. So thank you very, very much to Raymond, Jeremy, Victoria and Louise. As I said, incredibly interesting presentation, full of content, extremely valid, relevant and clearly of great interest to our members. Thank you all to our delegates. I would just say that I'd like to highlight our diversity, equity and inclusion training, which is a free benefit to MGAA members. You'll find recordings of the live webinars. There's one to go of a series of 6. There are some mini webinars and also some podcasts all on the same topic. So you'll find those as you log into your MGAA user account and head to your all events and schedule, and you'll find these there. And finally, if it's your intention to submit your observations and views on the FCA Diversity and Inclusion in Financial Sectors consultation, this really must be in by Friday so that we can meet the extended deadline that they've kindly allowed us to extend the deadline, the FCA, to have all of our members' views in so that we can collectively be the voice of your community. So thank you again for joining. It's very much appreciated. This will be recorded, edited, and the recording will be uploaded to the MGAA YouTube website, and the PowerPoint presentation will follow along with a feedback survey link. So do please take time to participate in that. Thank you very much, and wishing you all a very productive afternoon. Thank you.